Good afternoon, everyone. Allison Skalberg here, Consolidated Planning Group. We are so happy that you have joined us today. So today we have a brand new topic that we're talking about today with Dr. DeShanna Reed. We're excited to have her here with us. We're going to be talking about considering siblings and tips for preparing siblings for caregiver roles in the future. And so this is kind of it's a very interesting topic, and it's one that kind of crosses our mind a lot. So we're going to take a deeper dive into that today. Before we get started, I always just like to go over a few housekeeping items. Today we are in webinar mode. That means that we can't see you or hear you, but we know you're there, and we're glad that you've joined us today. We invite you to put your questions in the chat box. We're going to be taking questions throughout the presentation. Today's presentation is also being recorded. You're going to get a copy of today's slides and a link to the recording after the fact via email. If you sent in questions ahead of time, I do have those questions, so you don't have to put those in the chat box. So a little bit about Consolidated Planning Group. If you're joining us for the very first time, welcome. Again, we're glad that you're here. Our webinars started, I don't know, probably 5 years ago or more. And it was really based off of my own frustration on why is everything that we do as parents, our siblings, a caregiver for a loved one, why is everything we do so difficult? Consolidated Planning Group is a holistic special needs financial planning firm. We're nationally certified as Social Security advisors, members of the Special Needs Planning Academy, chartered special needs consultants. Our whole firm is nuanced in helping you plan for the future of a loved one with a disability. So whether that's a sibling, whether it's your own child, whether you're a caregiver, maybe you're a grandparent, we help you plan for the future of that loved one. We help put protection plans in place, lifetime care plans. So we do a lot of transition planning. We help establish ABLE accounts, and we do a lot of advocacy by way of webinars. We have the Consolidated Planning Group YouTube channel. There are almost 600 webinars on planning for special needs. So if you can think of a topic, we have probably covered it, and they're all archived out there on the Consolidated Planning Group YouTube channel that you can subscribe to for free. So, some of the things, and really Dr. Reed is going to be talking about a lot of this today, but who's going to care for your loved one when you're gone, whether it's your sibling, whether it's your child or a family member. And it's really kind of having a plan and working your plan is a very, it's a very important component to this. And what we really like to see, and Dr. Reed is going to talk to us about this. She's writing a book that's going to be coming out next year on these very topics, and I wrote a chapter in this book. But it's not waiting for the crisis to happen. If we can plan in advance, it doesn't make it easy, but it makes it a lot easier. And so we're very big advocates of planning for the future. So having said that, I want to give Dr. Reed as much time as we have today. If you're planning your time, your lunch hour, we're going for an hour today, so we will be done by 1 o'clock. And again, this is being recorded. Everybody is going to get a copy of the slides and a link to the recording. Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Reed, and I am excited for you to take over.
Well, thank you, Allison. I really appreciate it. And although I can't see everyone, welcome to this webinar. This is a very important topic, not just in general for people to know, but as a sibling, you'll see over the course of the presentation, this is very much ingrained into who I am and what I do as a professional. So let's get into a bit about me. I am a former classroom special education teacher and campus administrator, but we've got to rewind the clock back just a little bit. My background is actually in psychology with focus in behavioral health research. I went into psychology mainly because I wanted to understand behaviors in general, whether it had to do with a mental health disorder or with an intellectual or developmental disability. So I was interested in the different habits that were exhibited across populations. And of course, being an autism sibling, I had been immersed in the disabled community since I was a kid. So I was very interested in that. That then translated into my work with preschool children all the way through high school, plus as a transitions teacher and in community-based settings, such as day programs. I am an educational consultant, executive functioning coach, and non-attorney advocate. I do own a firm here in the Houston area that specializes in cultivating and addressing barriers to accessibility, equity, and inclusion for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, both in the school setting and in all areas of public life. I am the mother of four. I have a really great bunch of folks that are surrounding me and really encouraging the work that I do in the community. And I also am the youngest of four. You can see the picture there on the slide. It is myself and my three sisters. And the cornerstone of our family is Miss Adrian, who is in the green blouse there. She lives with level 3 autism and is mostly non-speaking, but she also enjoys a very full life living in the group living facility where she's been for the last 32 years. In addition to that, I am a two-time TEDx speaker and an author. As Allison mentioned, I am writing a book from the siblings' perspective, beginning from that and the crucial and important elements of caregiving that siblings need to know well in advance and before they move into those roles. And so I hope that the webinar that I am going to be presenting to you all gives you some valuable information, but also inspires parents to have these conversations early on with your typically developing children in preparation for and giving them the opportunity to have voice and choice in the role that they play for their sibling. So looking into the next slide, there's a few things over the course of our time together that I'd like to share with you, and they're there on your screen. But I think it's important for us to bring into the room the fact that siblings often face some special challenges in navigating our relationship alongside our disabled siblings. One of them is understanding our role and the potential responsibilities as children and into adolescence and eventually into adulthood. We want to be typical kids doing typical things, but we also know that our lives outside of what our peers see and what maybe some of our friends in general see is not exactly what one would consider normal or typical. Uh, we really want the opportunity to engage actively with siblings who kind of get it, but most of us really just kind of fade into the shadows. There was a TEDx talk a number of years before I did mine in which the speaker indicated the experience of being a typically developing child with a disabled sibling as glass children. We're there and very present, but sometimes we are kind of overlooked at times, not intentionally because our parents don't love or care about us, but because they're so ingrained in the day-to-day of the care that it requires for our sibling that sometimes we do kind of fade into the background and are almost kind of seen through. So it's important to know those things and really kind of have that mindset and considerations as we're going into this talk. What a family chooses to do or not do in terms of caregiving is a deeply personal decision that only you all can make. But I am here to be the voice of a sibling and share my experiences and the benefits that came with my parents being willing to have those very open, honest, and brave conversations with us about the reality of being Adrian's caregivers. So on to the next. There are some assumptions that people typically make about siblings of individuals with disabilities. Now, again, I mentioned that there's some challenges navigating our relationships and responsibilities alongside our disabled siblings. And when we're younger, I can recall in my younger years, we're kind of straddling two worlds. One of being a kid, again, wanting to do those kind of typical kid things, going to sleepovers and parties and hangouts and such like that. But we also know on the other side of that, sometimes we're serving as a co-caregiver. Or in some instances, in my experience as a teacher and campus administrator, some siblings were kind of almost acting as the de facto parent. As teens, we're in that situation where we're not quite grown, but we're grown enough to be doing some of the more mature levels and being able to demonstrate initiative in ways that maybe other children don't necessarily have to do because we are in a very unique family dynamic in which we are also helping to support our sibling as they grow. Our parents are managing the day-to-day care of our sister or brother. I can remember the first time I realized that Adrian's manifestation of autism was a unique one. Of course, the phrase, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, the manifestation is not the same for every individual on the spectrum. But I remember noticing that there were some differences and that I was being called upon to do things that maybe other people outside of my household and in different families weren't necessarily called to do. And it's a unique experience as the youngest with an 18-year age gap between me and the oldest, and a 17-year age gap between me and Adrian, and a 12-year age gap between me and the closest sister in age. Me being at home at a time when Adrian was already kind of into her adult years, but still very much needing a lot of care, kind of put me in a really unique position in that when my parents were at work and Adrian was home from the assisted living facility, well, not assisted living, when she was in the group living facility, I was the person that was there at home with her. So there was no going to sleepovers and parties and hanging out. And a great deal of my friends didn't even know that I had older siblings because of the fact that Adrian lived where she lived, and my oldest sisters were already out in the world with their families, getting married and doing other elements of their career. So it was a really unique experience to kind of straddle those two worlds. And we understand that our brother or sister has higher support needs than we do, but we also want the attention. And it's kind of a really hard line to walk, not wanting to be burdensome or bothersome, but also knowing that we also want the attention of our parents. And sometimes, in some instances, as I've experienced in the classroom, some attention is better than none. And it's not necessarily always the most positive, but nonetheless, we do still want to be able to have that kind of typical experience, understanding that that's not really the case. There's also considerations for us in dating relationships. We have to really be more cognizant of who we surround ourselves with as friends and potential mates, mainly because of the fact that we want to make sure that the person that we decide that we're going to be linked to is also accepting and understanding of the differences that our brother or sisters have. And so we're much more cognizant and aware of what people are saying out in the world. And that also kind of comes into play with both the strengths and the challenges of being a sibling to an individual with complex medical needs or a disability. The last element of this in particular is the transition into adulthood, which can get really, really tricky if we're not prepared. The notion of our parents or primary caregivers mortality is real. And we're aware of the fact that our parents or caregivers are not going to live forever. That means somebody is going to be stepping into their role. And that very well may be us, really depending on, of course, the planning process. We know our siblings differently than everyone else, and it's a unique experience for us. And we understand some of their limitations, but have also seen their progress and their triumphs through a lens that no one else has. And so while this is a unique experience, it is very nuanced. And the reality of it is when we move into that role, or should we, if we tasked with moving into that role, we have to be adequately prepared in order for it to be a successful one, not just for our sibling, but for us too. It's important that we understand the different systems that our siblings are part of, the benefits that they receive, and how to navigate their support needs as they grow and as we age as well. And so one of the elements of what I do in supporting families, particularly those who have typically developing children, is informing them of ways that you can approach these conversations with your typically developing children at the most appropriate time. You know your children better than anyone else, but I can say that the last minute is not the best minute to find out about what your role will be and the nuances of that. So then when we move on and we look at the transitioning to caregiving, will we or won't we? That's kind of a big question. It really all depends ultimately on what the plans are in place for families. I can say with my family in particular, the reason that I became so well versed in the different services and supports and resources and knowledge that my parents had was because I was very inquisitive. I wanted to know everything about everything, especially when it came to my dad. He is retired, or was rather, he's since deceased, but He was a retired Air Force tech sergeant. And over the course of their time, when Adrian was diagnosed in the late 1960s, before there were protections and before there were a lot of programs available for families of individuals with disabilities, and it was still possible for schools to turn students away with disabilities, my dad had to get very, very creative in learning about all of the available resources. So when he retired, not too long after I was born, he was prepared with all of that information. So when I was able to really understand more about what checks were coming to the house and why they were so colorful, he could explain to me where they were coming from. And over time, as he moved into working in different capacities with the state of Texas, he was able to tell me about Medicaid and Medicare and the different benefits that were available, and Social Security, disability insurance, and supplemental security insurance, and knowing what the difference between those two things was really helpful for me as I continued to grow and wanted to learn more and more about it. So having those conversations with me, not just with my dad, but with my mom too, about her experience as a mother and how she was feeling, and the transition to moving from one city to the next in order to be closer to what was at the time, back in the 80s, one of a very small handful of facilities that would be able to eventually meet the needs of Adrian as my parents were aging. So having those meaningful conversations really helped me really conceptualize what that could potentially look like. But I do know for a fact that the oldest sibling was essentially tasked with doing so, but didn't have the benefit of having those questions answered and those pieces of information given to her. It was just assumed that she was going to take on that role without really asking if that was something that she ultimately wanted to do. And so it's important to understand that the theory that we're just going to know what to do when the time comes because we've been watching isn't really an accurate one. Having the honest and intentional communication about the reality that we very well may one day serve in your stead as early on as appropriate demonstrates that you value the role that one day we will play and that we already play in our family, and that you want to have ongoing conversations with us so that we have the understanding and the skills and the resources if we decide that this is a role that we do want to take on. Preparation for
Dr.
caregiving
Reed,
roles were, yes,
I just wanted to say that I think one of the most, there's many complexities to this whole
sure.
topic that we're talking about, but one of the biggest complexities that people lose sleep over, maybe even cry over, is these public benefits and understanding, and they are so complicated.
Yes.
That's why we're busy. It
Mm-hmm.
is very, very complicated, but I just want to encourage anybody out there, whether you've got a kid turning 18 or you're here about siblings or whatever, there is a lot of help out there for you to navigate this. So if you feel like you were feeling pretty smart before and then you start reading about these public benefits and it feels overwhelming, I first just want to say you're absolutely not alone. Knowledge is power. The more you learn, the better it is. It is confusing. It is not you. It is unnecessarily difficult, is the way I would describe it. But these are all, I couldn't echo what you're saying enough. Learning about stuff like this, you mentioned, I think you mentioned military benefits and, there's laws about that and the military pension being able now to go to a special needs trust to preserve
Mm-hmm.
benefits. There's so many things out there. Some of these military benefits are often forgotten, and some of these people will have, they're considered a helpless child, and they'll have medical benefits through the military, through their TRICARE or whatever system they have going on. They may have benefits, they may be eligible for things for life, but kind of educating yourself and learning about these and not, again, waiting for the crisis to happen with a parent where they're incapacitated or they have passed away and all the things that they've learned over the years and what they've been doing are they take to their grave with them. So I think that's so important. But I just
Yeah.
mainly wanted to encourage that there's lots of help out there. And if you're feeling overwhelmed, it's not just you. It is ridiculously hard. So
Yes. I mean, and I think that that's important for us to kind of unpack a little bit of too. Um, the big element, I think, for me, outside of the fact that my lived experience was getting to know those things directly from people who saw things evolve to a place where there was more access to programs. And speaking to the military piece, there is the exceptional family member program that actually didn't really exist a whole awful lot when my dad was enlisted. But then over time, as more and more families came kind of out of the woodwork, because disability isn't new, right? It's just now we are focusing more on it. And so the more there were families that were willing to kind of be out there, out of the shadows, and not so much hiding away, as sometimes happened, there was more bravery on the part of other families to come forth and say, well, you know what, I'm experiencing that too. Hey, can you tell me more about the program that you got into, and how did you get onto what's now referred to as the interest list, but it used to be called something else? And what different things are available through what used to be MHMRA that is now here in Houston, the Harris Center for Mental Health and Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, and what services do they offer? The way that my parents were able to find out that information when it was still in its infancy, and then disseminate that information out to as many families as possible across the community, is what really was beneficial for me, seeing them do that. And ultimately, that led me to feel empowered and have a deep passion for providing this kind of support for families, particularly siblings who very well may move into these roles. And knowing what's out there is important. I do have some resources later that I'll share in terms of organizations for siblings of individuals with disabilities that you can encourage your child to at least learn more about as they continue to age. And there's more and more of them happening, and popping up all over. But here in the greater Houston area, there's a board that I am part of that has a citizens chapter in particular that I'm also a member of. And so there's a lot of different resources out there. And hopefully over the course of this talk, I'll be able to share a little bit more about those with you. So when we're looking at transitioning into the caregiving roles, it's important to note that it can be an emotionally charged experience. Okay, while there are some major highs with it, there's also a lot of fear and anxiety. It can be the mix of emotions from being very proud that you are serving in that capacity to be also very fearful and anxious about what that actually looks like, taking on that responsibility. And it's important to acknowledge that those are normal, natural feelings, and it's part of the process of moving into this role. It is a very unique experience that only other siblings understand. The second element is the shift in the dynamics of the family structure, which can also be really challenging. It's kind of a role reversal, if you will, that requires siblings to kind of adjust their expectations and redefine their relationships with some members of the family, including the primary caregiver. I think it's important to echo again what Allison mentioned, but siblings and families, you're not alone on the journey. We're out here. We really are. You may not necessarily know, but the disabled community and the disabled population is one that any person can join at any time. So supporting individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, complex medical needs, whether they're mental health needs or actually related to another type of disability or disorder, is an important element of community, and sharing as much information as possible, as often as possible, through open and honest conversations is the key to not just being prepared for when the time comes, but also for connecting with others. That creates an opportunity for a great deal of support and comfort and encouragement along the journey. Now, as we move forward in just a moment, we'll discuss some of the legal and financial support elements that are available to sibling caregivers. I'm going to give the disclaimer, I am not an attorney. This is not a substitute for legal advice. I'm also not a financial planner, nor am I a financial advisor. So please seek out the professionals who do those things. I can, however, tell you about my lived experiences and how things have been for us along the way. So we'll get into a little bit on that in just a second. So understanding the legal and financial aspects of becoming a caregiver is crucial for siblings. We must be equipped with the knowledge to navigate these caregiving responsibilities efficiently and ensure that our loved ones are well supported. So that means we also have to understand some of the legal considerations, and they are dependent upon the state in which you live. So I want to make sure that we're aware of that. If you're joining us from a state that is not Texas, you definitely want to reach out and learn more about the different offerings for services and supports in your state. But it's important to know that an additional element of this really also depends on whether guardianship will be maintained by the disabled person, or if it will be moving on into a full guardianship once the age of majority is reached, which is 18. Again, not an attorney. I want to make sure that you understand that what I am about to say is not legal advice, nor is it a substitute for speaking with a licensed and credentialed legal professional. But having said that, I want to unpack a few of the important legal considerations that, from my perspective in my family, we had open and honest conversations about. And I also unpack those in the TED Talk that I gave in Raleigh in 2023. It's available on YouTube if you want to check it out. So, guardianship is established when a court declares someone incompetent and appoints somebody else to make decisions on their behalf. For some families, you may have already started the process of researching guardianship, which is a good idea so that you have an understanding of what's going to happen as your child gets closer and closer to the age of majority. Some families may opt to obtain full legal guardianship, which is important and great if that is what you and your family decide to do. And it can require some annual review. My parents opted to not get full guardianship of Adrian, which is a unique one, I'm sure, because as you might be thinking, if she required enough 24-hour care to live in a group living facility alongside other individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, why wouldn't they obtain full guardianship? Well, because for my parents, it was always important for Adrian to still have her own autonomy and be able to at least provide some level of consent for things that pertain directly to her. So when both of my parents were still alive, of course, they were the ones that were the primary caregivers, and all decisions were made according to what was best for Adrian by both my parents. My father was the registered payee, which was the person who is responsible for the fiduciary elements of the benefits that Adrian was receiving through the federal government, and making sure that all of those things were in alignment. When my father passed away 10 years ago, that responsibility moved to my mother. And when my mother passed away 2 years after that, then that left Adrian as a ward of the court. Knowing those elements and knowing what I know about the legal elements of caregiving, I spoke with my other sisters. We came to the decision that we did not want to go for the guardianship element because we wanted to still continue to honor our parents' wishes. So we obtained power of attorney, and knowing the difference between those things is important. So going into a little bit about that without getting super duper deep into the weeds, power of attorney is a designation that allows us to make legal and financial decisions on behalf of Adrian. It can be customized to specific decisions, and it's distinct from guardianship because it does not declare a person incompetent, and it can be revoked at any time. We have durable power of attorney, but there are other elements of powers of attorney that you can explore, such as healthcare surrogacy, proxy, medical powers of attorney, financial powers of attorney. Any of those things are applicable depending on your family's situation. As I mentioned, when my mother passed, that responsibility came to us. At one point, there were some funds that were left in accounts that my parents both held. And in terms of what Adrian was allowed to receive in our family, she was not allowed to receive large sums of money, and it was written into both of their wills. So we honored those wishes and set aside that money in an account for Adrian should she need it. Um, after that.
I want to add a few things here. One of the
Okay.
things that you were talking about is her public benefits and that your
Mhm.
father was her representative payee.
Yes.
One thing that is largely not known is that you can name up to three successor representative payees for free through the Social Security Administration. And I
Yes.
strongly recommend that if an individual has a rep payee, that there are named three, up to three successors.
Mhm.
If there is not, what can happen, and Texas is not great as it relates to the timelines of the Social Security Administration, we're behind. But what can happen is those benefits can get frozen and
Mhm.
it can wait for a court order. It can be a long thing. Now they'll go back and pay him back, but that doesn't pay bills for the year or two or however long it takes. So you can eliminate that largely by having a successor representative payee. And some residential living places could be the successor representative payee if there was
Mhm.
nobody else. It's not usually what we recommend, but sometimes they do that. And
Mhm.
if after you there is nobody else, then naming that successor living place might be a thing to do. And then the other thing that I wanted to say is, the topic of guardianship and alternatives to guardianship, power of attorney, healthcare power of attorney, supported decision making agreement, HIPAA agreements. These topics come up all the time. We've done many, many, many webinars with attorneys on these topics. Every state is a little bit different as it relates to the laws, but in Texas, it's the least restrictive, most appropriate for the ward is the wording that they use. And what is right for one family may not be right for another family, and there's no
Sure.
judgment on that.
No.
But I
No.
want to just mention too, on the power of attorney and healthcare power of attorney supported decision-making agreement, I am a fan of that when the situation is right. But what I also want to caution people on is sometimes the situation isn't right for that. If a person does not have capacity or
Mhm.
the ability to understand what they're signing, then sometimes that's not a good fit and those documents can be rendered null,
Sure.
basically. So
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention that. But I also wanted to say is don't be afraid if you're coming up to this topic of guardianship or alternatives to guardianship. We'll be happy to make referrals to attorneys that are specifically nuanced in this. They're going to sit down with you, they're going to sit down with your loved one, and
Mhm.
they're going to guide you through the process and help you work through what is the most appropriate, least restrictive, most appropriate for the individual. So you don't have to know what you need when you go to sit down with them. I just want to tell people that that's their job. They're going to do it that way. So don't feel nervous about it.
Sure. And I think that that also goes back to my point about support and connectedness in community. And within all of those elements is the element of communication, which is why the open, honest, and intentional conversations are so important. The more that we talk about these things and bring them out into the open, the more comfortable we become in our community, the more inclusive we become in our community, and the more accessible our community becomes for families of individuals with disabilities and for the individuals themselves. So going back to my experience and as a sibling caregiver who also has power of attorney, to Allison's point about the representative payee, yes, the group living facility in that instance did become the representative payee, and Adrian does have an ABLE account that was established for her. And we're grateful for those things and the forethought that our parents had in developing these plans and keeping us informed and bringing us into the fold was ultimately what set us up to be in the positions that we are in now. And is also why I am so much of an advocate for supporting families of individuals with disabilities, particularly siblings, so that you're prepared for what this looks like going forward. And you can make those conversations a regular one that you have annually. I know, for example, I just had an annual meeting for Adrienne with her team that supports her through the Harris Center. And it's essentially like a very grown up IEP meeting, if you will. We've been talking about her progress and the things that are working, the things that are not working, and especially in light of the challenges with funding from the federal government, and really expressing our concern about whether or not she'll be able to continue living in the facility where she's been for the last 32 years. So those are important elements that we've discussed, and my sisters and I have also discussed what our succession plan is in the event that these other challenges continue in terms of funding for families and for individuals with disabilities. What does that look like for us going forward? So we have a plan in place for where Adrienne would go should she not be able to continue living in the facility where she's been for so long. And we also have had to consider the different concessions that we would have to make. And the oldest, of course, has the house with the most room that would be able to accommodate Adrienne in the event that that was the case. But I also have two children in the middle that are graduating from high school this coming year. And so that will free up some space too. So we'll have the ability to kind of navigate back and forth between those. But that's the reality that us siblings are facing, which is why it's so important for parents to be willing to yield and have these kinds of really honest conversations so that we don't end up in a position where a crisis has occurred and the only pieces of information that were really known went with the person who's no longer in the driving seat.
I just
So,
wanted to say in the chat box, the grown-up IEP was a figure of speech.
yes, yes,
It's a meeting about the person. I always think about nothing about them without them.
sure.
Or we also have heard the terms of person-centered planning.
Yes,
Those are some of those things. So there's not a quote unquote grown-up IEP. It's just a
no,
figure of speech, but it's a similar meeting, only it's not about school. It's about their life and the happenings of
yes,
their life and what their needs are and getting their needs met, basically. I just wanted to do that.
yeah,
All right, and so are we good on this slide or you
yes.
want to go to the next one?
We're going to the next one. But yes, so there are the financial considerations that siblings need to be made aware of. So the majority of individuals with an intellectual or developmental disability or those with higher medical or mental health support needs typically live in their home. There's another slide that I will be showing in just a moment that actually came. There's this one here where you can see the family support. This is expenditures that come from the federal government, and this was actually from the United States State of the State report developed in collaboration with the University of Kansas. And so looking at this here, just overall, the fiscal spending as of fiscal year 2023 on family support is there listed in millions. I went ahead and put a rectangle around that, and that represents the amount of family support that is typically rendered for individuals with disabilities who continue to reside within their family home. The next slide, we could go to that one. This is in terms of dollars, this is what our reality is in terms of residential setting. So you can see here, this graph in particular outlines more of a pictogram, really, former math teacher here. But anyway, when you're looking at this, this is also in thousands of dollars, actually, instead of the millions of dollars. But this is annual cost of care. So when you look at supported living, which could be an inclusive setting where you have individuals with disabilities living alongside individuals who do not have disabilities, that there is a pretty substantial number, right? Then you look further down on the graph and it outlines for you the different expenditures in terms of annual cost by the residential setting. So in the setting where Adrienne lives, hers is considered a public, if you will, if it has less than 16 residents living in that facility, which her cottage is divided up into two different cottages, and there's 6 in one and 8 in the other. This is the expenditure for residential setting in terms of the public living facilities. She was, again, on the interest list. I do remember mentioning that briefly. And we got on the interest list. My dad got her on the interest list actually back in the 80s. So about 19, I would say maybe 81, 82, if memory serves, is when my dad was able to get her on the list. We moved from San Antonio to Houston in 1987 to be closer to the small handful of facilities that were available in the state, and the closest one was still an hour plus away from where we lived in Pasadena. And so when Adrian was able to get into the group living facility, it was 1993. So if you do the math on that, from the early 80s until 93 was how long it took her. And that list is considerably longer, and the wait is substantially more now, ranging in anywhere between 15 and 20 years here in the state of Texas in order to get into some of the group living facilities. And of course, the consideration for residential setting is unique to each family. My parents took a lot of years to decide what they wanted for Adrian when they were no longer able to physically care for her as they continued to age. And so it was important for them to be able to find some place that would be best suited for her. Whereas in other families and in other cultures, that's not the case. And so those considerations should be made early on, and those conversations about the financial responsibilities of becoming a caregiver had as well in those conversations. And so then on the next slide, when we take a look at on supporting disabled persons into the transition into adulthood, there's three main areas that I really focus on. And the first of them is education and career planning. So when we're talking about education and career planning, that could be obtaining the services of a professional who works with individuals with disabilities in the transition from the K-12 environment into adulthood. It definitely can require a fair amount of emotional strength, because it can be a challenge, especially if parents are still around and they're having to kind of deal with the reality of their own mortality and what that's going to look like as you transition into adulthood. But the biggest element with that is understanding the accommodations and modifications that your sibling is receiving. So for your typically developing children, if they can be involved in at least knowing, just in the K-12 environment, what the accommodations and modifications are that their sibling receives at school. That doesn't mean that they have to be sitting in on the admission review or dismissal or ARD meeting with them, but at least them knowing, hey, my brother or sister has these specific accommodations and they work well both at home and at school, so that they can also be part of that team. Not meaning that they have to carry the load of that, but them at least knowing helps us feel a lot more included and like we're actually part of what's to come for our sibling. It's
The
also
question I'm
beneficial
about
to
to
know
ask
the
you, there
Mhm.
could really probably be a whole webinar on this topic, but one
Right.
person had wrote in how to make the two younger brothers, ages 12 and 16, understand and love them
Mm,
more. I mean, so I
mhm,
think that there could be, you touched on this in the beginning as kind of,
mhm.
I use the term the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So like
Sure.
sometimes other siblings feel unseen,
Right.
unheard,
Mhm.
because the attention of the family members are going towards the individual with a disability, or maybe an
Yeah.
unequal distribution of attention, right?
Sure.
And
Yeah.
so there can be jealousy issues, but do you have any suggestions for parents that want to even that field? And I think of the word you know loving, a loving sibling relationship as opposed to an obligatory relationship, because
Sure.
later down the road, if they just have a true appreciation, they truly love their sibling. The truth is a lot of siblings similar in age, and definitely if they're younger, they don't always have the capacity to understand what's going on. They see the big meltdown. They see chaos. They
Yes.
know that at home it isn't normal. They go to their friend's house and they see normal, and whatever is normal anyway. Who even knows what that is, right? Um,
Right. I haven't met it yet, but if
but
you
how,
do, let me
yeah, but
know.
how do they help their younger kids or siblings cope more effectively now, so that later on in adulthood that they're going to be better prepared for some of these roles that you're talking about?
Sure, and that's a really great question. My suggestion has always been, be as open and honest as is appropriate for your child's age. If they're seeing the behaviors, that means that they're noticing that there is something that is not like what they would normally do. So rewinding it back a little bit, I remember when I first noticed that there were differences with Adrian, mainly because when she was excited, there would be a lot of humming and rocking and hand flapping. When she was anxious or not feeling comfortable, she would plug her ears and they would be higher pitched and different sounds. And there were instances in which she would get very, very upset, and sometimes it would get physical. Not very often, but sometimes it would. And I know that in her younger years, that was a lot more often and a lot more prevalent, as she was really trying to communicate her needs or the way that she was feeling at the time, but not having the words to speak to say it. But I remember those things. And in those instances, the best thing that I would suggest is to have honest conversations about it. Help your children understand, for example, autism spectrum disorder for my family, helping them kind of understand what that means. That this is something that is not just happenstance and all of a sudden you caught it like it's the flu. That's not exactly how that goes, right? So having conversations with them about what the disability is, and as much as you're comfortable, I can't ever underestimate the role that a skilled clinical professional can have in helping siblings kind of cope and understand a bit more about how they feel about um, their siblings' disability and the ways that they have to navigate life a little bit differently because other people really don't understand what it's like to be us. And so speaking with a counselor can be really helpful. Connecting them with other siblings who also have a disabled brother or sister can be really beneficial. Not as if we're like comparing notes, like, what does yours do? What does yours do? Not necessarily in that respect, no, but having open conversations about disability and removing the stigma, especially across cultures, is one of the best ways to help get your children to a place where they have a deeper set of empathy and understanding of what's going on and what works best in terms of helping to de-escalate that. If it's a particularly large reaction or particularly large meltdown, as some label them, what's the process of addressing whatever antecedent it was? So what was happening right before that, and knowing those different signs and what some may refer to as triggers, and sometimes they're just completely out of the blue, and it could be something that the individual can't communicate, such as if there's a urinary tract infection or there's some pain somewhere. Having the words to be able to speak that out can be different for individuals with different disabilities. And so having those kinds of conversations with your children about those things. I mean, 12 and 16, I'm not going to tell you what you should or shouldn't do with your family, but that's a reasonable age to be able to understand the differences. They've already noticed the differences. They've known it for quite some time. They just didn't directly state them usually. So having those
So
conversations about the manifestation of the disability, the de-escalation elements that can be really beneficial. How do they feel when those things are happening? And what are some things that they need after that event has occurred? Because once the episode has passed with the individual, they're finished with it. But then there's still the aftermath of everyone else who was around, and having those kinds of conversations about how they feel when they are in the area when these things occur, and just really having opportunities to express how they feel and ask them questions. What is it that you want to know? What is it that you wish you knew more about? How would you feel if you one day became a caregiver, especially the 16-year-old? How would you feel about that? And for the record, a 16-year-old might tell you absolutely no, I don't want any part of that at 16, but that doesn't mean that that's going to be their answer at 26 or even at 18. I know for me, no one anticipated that I, the youngest of the bunch, was going to be the one that would play the most active caregiving role. But I do.
I think that the support groups, if it's not a place to necessarily just dump your bucket,
No.
but support groups for siblings, I think are good. And at least that individual knows that they are not alone in this.
Yeah.
They are not alone. There are other people like them that
Hmm.
live similar paths, right? And
Right.
and so I think that there is strength in that. And I just wanted to encourage you that like in Houston, there's the Baylor Transition Clinic. It's a very
Right.
good clinic. They have child life specialists and things like that.
Mhm.
asking your the child life specialist at the specialty clinic that you go to about support groups surrounding such things like this for siblings. They may be able to direct you and point you to some specific ones that they know are good. But I do think it is worth checking out. And part of it is just, you can't put a grown-up head on a child's shoulders. They are not going to think like we think as adults, and we didn't think like we think now, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Back then. So I think it's a lot of it along the way, but I think a lot of it is that the natural sibling rivalry. And so if we've got one kid that is, neurodiverse and has these big meltdowns or big behaviors that are clearly unacceptable, and then they get by with them. Whereas something much lesser offense of a neurotypical, when they do it, is, they're keeping score. So that's part of it, and it does definitely make it complicated, doesn't it?
Sometimes it does, yeah, but I can say that something that I've seen in some families that I have worked with is because the conversations about the disability were so open and very candid, there wasn't so much of this person, your brother or sister, is getting away with behaving in this way simply because there's still consequences for our actions. The consequences look differently when you're working with an individual who has an intellectual or developmental disability or an emotional disturbance or whatever the co-occurring challenges are. There's still consequences that are associated with that. Understanding that equity is not the same as equality, right? Um, just because this person over here gets this consequence does not then mean that this person over here is going to get the exact same consequence. They're completely different people with completely different manifestations of a variety of things. And so the equitable piece is each person getting what it is that they need in order to be successful, which means you may have a consequence that doesn't seem equal, but it is equitable because it's an alignment with what each person is experiencing, whether you are neurodivergent or not. And so there are, of course, some sibling rivalries that occur for sure. But in families that I've worked with where the conversations about the disability and about the manifestations and about the behaviors were really honest and really open about what is happening in those moments, it has kind of helped mitigate some of that. Not to say that I haven't had students, for example, who had a sibling that had particularly challenging behaviors, um, feel really upset and bothered and like I don't even know like what this happens at home and then it just sets everybody off and now my whole day is warped. That's understandable. That's also where the support of a clinician can come in and speaking with them about their feelings about the matter and helping to facilitate some conversations. A good marriage and family therapist may be an option for a family who is really trying to navigate that and provide the typically developing sibling with space to voice how they feel while also allowing the parents the opportunity to actively engage in conversations about how to make sure that the typically developing child's needs are also met over the course of their lifespan, not just, in their younger years, and the adjustments that have to be made over the course of their time growing up together. So it is a
Um,
journey. It is
we
definitely not a destination. So
We have a
it is,
couple of questions and we're
sure.
running out of time for today. Our
Yeah.
youngest
Yeah.
son, who is typically developing, sometimes will ask, will I have to take care of my brothers when I get older? And
Hmm.
so to
You want me
me,
to answer that one? Mm.
one of the things that we talk about, Dr. Reed, is,
Yeah.
it depends. It depends on what you want. And I
Yeah.
think as parents, as you're considering this, what Dr. Reed mentioned was a very large age difference and age gap in her siblings. Not
Hmm.
everybody has that.
No.
So it's not always a fit if the kids are similar ages. And the other thing that you have to consider too is if you're considering whether or not your other child will be a future caregiver for your disabled child is, what are their hopes and dreams, like she was
Hmm.
talking about earlier. And, would them being a caregiver for your loved one affect marriages or school or career or any of those things? Because they absolutely can.
Yeah.
And so we're definitely fans. I mean, we see families such as yours, that it's a perfect situation and you're happy with the role and you were taking it all in and learning from your dad. And then we see other people that were thrown into this role because there was no planning. It
Sure.
wasn't a plan. This is like default because this is what happened. And
Yes. Yes.
and it is less than ideal. So when we plan ahead, and we plan, and how much money do we need to fund a special needs trust to pay for a care facility,
Hmm.
like Dr. Reed's sister is in, that she has some autonomy and friends and community and all of those things, because all of those things are very important in the life of your family member. How much money do we need to fund that special needs trust? Why do we need a special needs trust?
Hmm.
What does that look like? And then maybe the sibling is not the quote unquote caregiver, but maybe they are the trustee of the special needs trust that is funding care as you laid out and as your heart and desire is for your loved one. And they're kind of overseeing, they're in a role to where they can be a friend and a confidant, and not an obligatory relationship. And so what I would say is none of those scenarios are wrong. It depends on what you want for your loved one with a disability. It depends on what you want for your other children. But other children may not always be in a good position. They could have children of their own with chronic illness or disabilities or have dicey situations. There's so many things. I call it life. Life just happens.
Yeah. Sure.
And
Yeah.
and so that's why, having these intentional conversations with each other, if you're married, spouses, with other family members, and what does this look like? I have a situation right now, and the mother has always been a caregiver for her disabled son who is in his 60s, and she just died this summer. And the other brother, who is like, I don't know, 3 years, call it 3 years younger than him, has now taken on the caregiver role, which is fine. They're of sound mind and body right now, but when the brother is no longer of sound mind and body and may need care himself, the disabled brother will likely be in a similar situation given age. And so these are all things to consider.
Sure. And that's really the main um takeaway from this, honestly, is that the open, honest, and intentional conversations had early on, without there just being an assumption, is really beneficial. As I mentioned, it was assumed that my older sister was going to be the one that would move into this role, and she was kind of dictated to, one day you're going to be the one taking care of Adrian. But that wasn't the case. It actually became me, the youngest, and I am married and have been married and divorced and remarried, and I have children of my own. And so I always knew that there was going to be some role that I was going to play in supporting Adrienne across her lifespan. And I knew that she, and of course us, were going to most likely outlive our parents, which we have. And so I can really credit them with what they were willing to do in terms of preparing us for what this looked like, understanding the fact that, in my work in developing this book, talking with different siblings and hearing their stories, even though some of them are close in age, the conversation was never had about whether or not they were going to become caregivers. And so they were really unsure of what even to do. And some are wanting to have those kinds of conversations right now, but one or the other parent or primary caregiver really doesn't want to yield that information. But they're also over the age of 60 and continuing to age. And eventually that responsibility is going to go to someone. And while you are still in the position of sound mind and body and able to prepare the person who will step into that role, the best thing that you can do is give them voice and choice, be really honest and candid about the needs that your disabled child has and what that can look like moving forward, so that they can make an informed decision without there being the assumption that they will or won't. I know for me, I shudder with obligatory relationships because, to be really honest, I'm Adrian's sister because I'm Adrian's sister, not because I have to be, but because that's who I am. And my role as her caregiver is not something that I do out of obligation. I do it because I love her and because I know her differently than anyone else would. And for me, I feel equipped and empowered, not just through what my parents did, but also my experiences in working with families for the last several decades and hearing their stories and being able to share with them the information and the knowledge and the tools that my parents gave to me as I was coming up. And so, in the last little minute that we have left, um, I would say another important element for siblings to know is the different agencies that are available here in the state of Texas. We have the Texas Workforce Commission that provides vocational rehabilitation services to individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Service providers such as myself offer these services based on what the individual qualifies for. It is assigned according to the high school in which your loved one attends. And so it's important to know that the VR counselor that you receive is actually attached to the high school in the general vicinity of where you live and your child graduated from or completed their program in. So knowing those things going in is important. Here in Houston, we have the Harris Center for Mental Health and Intellectual and Developmental Disability. So the local Intellectual and Developmental Disability Authority, or the LIDA, can help you find the right agencies. And also making sure that you connect with other organizations that are out in the community. And so wrapping it up, there was a slide right before this that actually had some sibling resources. There's the Sibling Support Project, for example. These are available online. You can access them. There's the Sibling Leadership Network. There's also another one that I have become more acquainted with and more involved with, and that is the Profound Autism Sibling Action Network through the Profound Autism Alliance. There's also an organization called Siblings with a Mission that is actually out of Ohio. It was started by a fellow sibling who is in medical school and is the brother of an individual with an intellectual and developmental disability. And then also some organizations that are here in the greater Houston area that if you have an older child with a disability and you want for them to have mentorship and opportunities to engage actively in the community and develop some of their public speaking skills. There's, of course, Best Buddies. I'm part of the Houston Area Advisory Board, and I'm also part of the Citizens chapter in helping work with bringing the living, Best Buddies Living, to our area as well. And so those are really great organizations that you can check out. My information is here on this slide. You can email me, you can find me on social media, you can text, but make sure that you let me know that you saw me on this
Awesome.
consolidated planning webinar, because otherwise I'm probably not going to respond.
There you go. Okay. Well, Dr. Reed, thank you for sharing this. Everybody is going to get a copy of today's slides and a link to the recording, and it will have Dr. Reed's contact information on there so you can reach out to her directly. Guys, we have webinars on every single topic. We didn't get to SSI. That's a whole topic in itself, but one person to ask a question is if they're already getting SSI, does it automatically transfer on the 18th birthday? And the answer is absolutely not. You got to
No,
work with the
it
Social
doesn't.
Security Administration. There is a
Yeah.
special form. If your child is still going to be a student to age 19, that you can continue
Yeah.
benefits, it needs to be signed by the school.
Yeah.
And you do have to reapply. So you're going to want to be in contact with the Social Security Administration. But we have webinars on Medicaid waivers. We have Medicare, Medicaid, SSI, SSDI, special needs trust, guardianship, alternatives to guardianship. That's all going to live on that Consolidated Planning Group YouTube channel. So, things to keep on your radar, and that'll be in our slides. You can take a look at, and they all live out there. And then you'll have a link to our upcoming webinars, where you can sign up for any of the ones that are topics that are relative to the step that you're on your journey. We work on a collaborative team here at CPG. We stand ready to help you plan for the future of your loved one, and we always offer free personalized consultations. This QR code will take you to our calendar where you can schedule your free 45-minute consultation. So if you had questions that didn't get answered today, reach out. We're happy to help you. During that consultation, we'll learn a little bit more about you, the planning that you've done so far. What are your big keeping you up at night issues that you feel like need to be solved. And we'll share a little bit more about how we work and the doors that you can walk through at CPG. It has certainly been my pleasure being here with you today, Dr. Reed. You did a fantastic job. Thanks, everybody. Sorry we went a little bit over. And be on the lookout for the email with the slides and the recording. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye now.